So welcome everyone. I hope you can listen to me well. Thank you to those joining us live and to those listening in afterwards. I'd also like to warmly welcome our guest today, whom I'll shortly introduce. My name is Jaime Acosta. Jaime, if you wish. I'm a practicing community pharmacist from Madrid, Spain, and currently the community pharmacy section of the FIP professional secretary. FIP's vision is a world where everyone benefits from access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable medicines and health technologies. Our mission is to support global health by enabling the advancement of pharmaceutical practice, sciences, and education. We are very pleased to be delivering this event, which is the episode number 16 of our program of 17 events on self-care, called Shaping the Future of Self-Care Through Pharmacy. As healthcare providers, pharmacists have an important role to play in supporting self-care, of course. This program is composed of 8 episodes that refocus on accelerating universal health coverage for all by enabling self-care through community pharmacy. Additionally, 9 episodes are being focused on self-care support for community pharmacy teams and better practice. So just a few housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed via YouTube. I know this is very important for many of you. You will receive a personalized certificate of attendance by email automatically after the event finishes. Just expect a short delay in the receiving that email. The recording will be available on our website after the event as our recording. You may ask questions and are actually encouraged to do so using the question box provided. Please use the Q&A box instead of the chat box. It is more convenient for our guest speakers. You are, of course, welcome to provide any feedback you want to provide us with, which is very valuable for us through the webinars at fip.org email address. And you can consider becoming an FIP member at the FIP webpage. Of course, we want to thank Rekin for supporting this online program, which is free of charge for you. Thank you to Rekin, which is a sponsor for this webinar. Today's program, my first welcome. We have approaches to switching prescription to non-prescription medicines by Dr. Natalie Gold from New Zealand. After that, what medicines should be available over the counter and why, from Andy Shirtcliffe from New Zealand too. And our last speaker for today will be Professor Anthony Serracino Inglot, from Malta, with his presentation called Latest Diagnostics Point of Care Testing Available in the Pharmacy. And after that, we will have a panel discussion with our 3 guest speakers with trying to answer your questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box available for you. And then we will close today's webinar. The learning objectives for today are describing current approaches to switching medicines from prescription to non-prescription and how this supports self-care. We will discuss which medicines should be available over the counter in the pharmacy and explain how diagnostics point of care testing can support better self-care by patients. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce you to our first speaker today, Dr. Natalie Gold. Her background is community pharmacy, both in New Zealand and in the UK, where she owned her own pharmacy for 5 years. Currently, sorry, it was the wrong bio. My apologies. I'm very sorry. Dr. Natalie Gold has driven widened access to medicines for many years, including being a member of the Medicines Classification Committee in New Zealand and driving world-leading reclassification work, for example, in oral contraceptives, vaccinations, and first in world reclassifications of sildenafil and topical calcipotriol. She has also researched increasing access to medicines, including analyzing how and why countries vary in reclassification of medicines, with evidence from oseltamivir, trimethoprim, and sildenafil reclassifications, and funded availability of maternal vaccinations through pharmacy. Natalie's access to medicines work extends to hepatitis C diagnosis and treatment through pharmacy, and has a master's and pharmacy administration of a blood product on prescription to pregnant women. Natalie has a master's of pharmacy degree and PhD. She is a fellow of the Pharmaceutical Society of New Zealand, and her awards for her access to medicines work include Distinguished Alumnus of the School of Pharmacy at the University of Otago in 2019. Thank you, Dr. Gold, for your presentation today. I apologize for not saying properly your bio at the beginning. You may begin, please.
Thank you very much. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'll say tonight, because we're in the evening in New Zealand. And what we're looking at is the different medicines available, the process of getting them available, and I'm going to touch on the variation between countries, because if we look at all these this lovely plethora of medicines that have been switched in different countries, there is no single country that has all of them, and that's rather intriguing. And of course, there's so many opportunities with such medicines. It would be lovely to be able to get more. So just quickly, why do we want switch anyway? Well, patients want it. Here's some data from Australia that shows that oral contraceptives and erectile dysfunction products were particularly of interest to people some years ago. And if we look at Germany, we can see that emergency contraceptives, when it became switched, suddenly they went up quite a lot. And there was a very strong move very quickly from prescription use to OTC, showing that that really suited patients so much better. But of course, it's not only the patients who benefit from it. There's also the pharmacist, and you can see here, that we can actually do so much more with our knowledge if we have switched medicines than some of the tasks that happen in pharmacy. There's a lot of other benefits, not only for the patient, but there's also savings for the health system, which is always talked about. There's the potential for emergency contraceptives to be more effective because they're used earlier. There's increased efficacy, so that means better for the patient, but also less need for the health system. Smoking cessation products increased in uptake after a switch, so there's public health benefits there, and you can even get referral into the health system. And when I wrote the application for sildenafil, I was saying, instead of the usual, this will take pressure off the health system, I said, well, actually, this may well send more people into the health system than currently are in it, because some men who have who present with ED will actually need to see a doctor and the pharmacist, and we know anecdotally that there are some cases of men who haven't seen the doctor who needed to, being passed on by the pharmacist. On the right is a little graph that shows that sildenafil, by being made available without prescription in New Zealand, was associated with a reduction in online purchasing. The reclassification or switch happened late 2014, and there has been a reduction since, which is good news, because online purchase may be counterfeit and may not have a health professional involved, so much safer to have the pharmacist doing it. So the typical switch process is that the applicant will follow the guidelines. There will be a look at the benefits within the application, the risks, and how the risks are mitigated. And typically there'll be evidence provided. Now, I'll just note that the research that I've done around switch has been in developed countries, and that's what I'm concentrating on tonight. So I do apologise that I am not able to talk too much about the developing countries, which have their own sort of unique features. Typically what happens though is that a sponsor prepares an application, that this is submitted to the medicines regulator, that this is evaluated, and that there is a committee that looks at it, and a recommendation or a decision is made, and then that's put into action through a gazettal or an ordinance or some other way of doing it. But of course, that's a very simplified way of looking at it, and there's a huge amount of variation, and some of this variation is indicated in the slide. And there's some really interesting examples of different features from different countries. And wouldn't it be terrific if we could take the best from each of them and make a recommendation that this is how it should happen? Maybe FIP and pharmacy organisations could do such a thing and improve it. So Australia, New Zealand, Japan, anyone can submit an application. It's not limited to the sponsors. And that's how naloxone has been switched in Australia. Some countries will have a special switch committee, and there's many of those examples, whereas some jurisdictions use a wider medical committee that's not specific to switch. And examples of that are the EU and the UK. What happens there is that they can have a very busy meeting with a huge number of things going on, large number of new medicines being looked at, and the switch can be just a small part of it. And they also are not specifically chosen for their expertise for switch. So you may get some real big brains around the table who actually don't know very much at all about the pharmacy-patient interaction and have a really strong focus on the medical side. So that can be quite difficult to get a switch over the line in that case, potentially. Sweden doesn't even use any committee, so that's different again. Transparency can vary between the committees. New Zealand has very high transparency. The application is available for all to see. Now, I don't think there's any other countries that do that, and as a result, we see very, very few applications now coming from multinational pharmaceutical companies, because that's their IP out in the public domain for everyone else to pick up. US has high transparency around the committee process with a transcript of, with a public hearing and a transcript. And then others have rather low transparency, and that is makes it far more worthwhile for the pharmaceutical companies to actually put in an application. There may be external evaluation or internal evaluation. Public involvement can have absolutely none to some to quite a lot, and there's a lot of flexibility for some small countries. Singapore and New Zealand, that's a part of their success in having a lot of switch, is the way that they don't necessarily require the packaging to change, because they have other ways of doing things. Some may require special studies, and the US requires more studies than anywhere else to inform that their decision. And that's probably primarily because they do not have a pharmacy only or pharmacist only category. And that causes some difficulties in terms of you haven't got the pharmacist to help somebody through. New Zealand doesn't require any studies, and that's helpful for a small market where it's not possible to do those sorts of studies. And because we have pharmacist only and pharmacy only categories, they're not needed to the same extent. A real difficulty for a number of companies wanting to put in an application is where there's an immediate generic entry when you do a switch. So the company that's put in all the effort puts in the application, everybody else knows about it, anybody else can apply for the labelling change at the same time, and so you get this immediate generic entry. And Germany and Austria also have it, along with Australia and New Zealand, and that creates some real difficulties for those companies. It's very difficult to get a return on their investment in doing this. There's on the other hand, at the other end, there is possible data protection of 3 years in the US and Japan based on research that they need to be doing, and 1 year in the EU and UK, although that 1 year their requirements are really rather stiff, and generally it isn't sought or given. Strangely enough, we have sometimes regulator or government-driven switches, and that's actually quite a smart thing to do. Ireland did it with adrenaline for a public safety perspective, to make it more available for management of anaphylaxis. New Zealand did a huge wave of these in the early 1990s. Sweden did it in early 2000 with a proton pump inhibitor, and Denmark did a lot in 1988-89. So we have quite a bit of variation over time as to which countries try different things. So each country will have guidelines, but I'm going to talk through the EU 2006 guideline, because this is a really important one for a lot of the developed countries, and it's not terribly different from some of the other areas anyway, because we're all going to be considering risks. We're all going to be thinking about, well, it needs to be prescription when there's significant danger. And there's a whole heap of areas that we're looking at, and that includes, could it mask an underlying condition? Could it create resistance? That's a key one for antimicrobials, and is a real challenge to work through. And is the condition self-assessable? Can the consumer understand how to navigate the challenges of contraindications, precautions, and so on? Criterion 2, prescription when there's a lot of incorrect use, and codeine has been upscheduled in many countries to prescription as a result of this concern. Criterion 3 covers a medicine that may be relatively new on the market, or it hasn't been used in children very much, so we need to get that experience in the prescription space before we put it into OTC. Having said that, usually medicines have to be on the market in the country for 3 or 5 years in that country for enough knowledge. But when we reclassified shingles vaccine a few years ago, it had only been in New Zealand for 6 months, but we had good data out of the US that gave an indication of its safety. So sometimes there can be a good argument made. Criterion 4, prescription when injected. That shows that this guideline is really out of date and needs to be updated. 2006, there wasn't nearly as much vaccination by pharmacists, so pharmacists weren't doing injections. Well, now they are a lot more, and I think that needs to be reviewed. And of course, many medicines have a number of different requirements around them to make them suitable for non-prescription. So they may have maximum strength, maybe only as a topical, not an oral. Their packaging may have special precautions on it, maybe only certain indications, that sort of thing. So those are a number of the areas that are common internationally. What's really interesting about those sort of criteria is that there's a really strong focus on risk and no mention of benefits often. And there's also a lot of judgment involved. And that means that we can have sort of quite a lot of variation. And to try and help address this, the BRASS model came out showing a framework of benefits and risks. And this helps a company to shape their application, to shape the work that they want to do around it, and to shape their discussions with the medicines regulator. It also helps to keep people grounded in the fact that actually there can be quite good benefits of the switch. And sometimes we can focus so much on the risks that we forget that the benefits may well outweigh the risk. I've talked a little bit about variation, and here's some great examples. Salbutamol inhaler is prescription only in New Zealand and most other countries, and pharmacist only in Australia, and that dates back to the 1980s. And New Zealand did consider it and decided that it shouldn't be, but we're looking for more information to ensure there wasn't going to be patient harm if it changed, and no further information was forthcoming from any applicant. Adapalene gel, that was considered in 3 different countries around the same time: US, Germany, and New Zealand. And we put it in New Zealand without even having a sponsor application involved. It was done by a pharmacy group. US and Germany at the same time were probably sponsor. And it didn't go through in Germany, but the other 2 countries it did. And what the big difference is Germany, while having a pharmacy only category, they were very, very nervous about it having a retinoid in it, because they were the country who had a history, really important history with thalidomide, and they did not want to see sort of reproductive toxicity occurring again. And of course, the data had to be shown to satisfy US and New Zealand, and it was. They were very satisfied with the data, but the Germans just did not want to overcome that history and that concern. Another one here of interest is the pill danach in Germany, the emergency contraceptive pill, and also in Austria. And in Germany, the committee thought that the evidence was fantastic, recommended it to get switched, and in Austria the committee said it couldn't possibly be switched. And then the opposite happened with the next part of the process. So in Germany, committee recommended for it to happen, and then it got stuck in the federal process and got stopped at that point with political pressure. While in Austria, after the committee said made a recommendation against, the Minister of Health said, well, it's going to happen anyway. So it shows that committees and parts of the process can vary quite considerably. Omeprazole is another example. Didn't switch in Japan, switched in many other countries, and in Japan they're concerned about gastric cancer because they have quite high rates of it nationally. So why does this variation happen? Well, there's a whole host of reasons. Part of it, the process, also who's on the committee, all sorts of things, how the committee feels about the pharmacy profession and about what consumers do. Companies, will a company put in an application? In Japan, they're really hesitant because they don't want to upset the doctors, because the doctors' association there is so very strong. And the people who you have on the committee, the kinds of people who make up the committee, but also who the individuals are, that can make a big difference. And an international industry participant in the research that I did around this said, it's not such an objective process anywhere around the world. There is always some level of subjectivity and emotion, and that comes through very clearly. And just to give an example of how committees can vary so much and how things can change over time, this is Australia versus New Zealand. On the left, the graph shows the Australian decisions, and this is based on a lot of work I did trawling through meeting minutes. And what it shows is that over these 4-year chunks of time, how many applications there were for major prescription to non-prescription switches, and whether they actually got through or whether they were rejected. And what we can see here is that in the earlier period, Australia had a reasonable number of applications and considerations, and actually just over half of them got approved. And in that same period in New Zealand, we had fewer applications, but we had very low approval rate. And medicines such as moderate potency corticosteroids and proton pump inhibitors got turned down despite the fact that they were agreed upon in Australia in that same period of time, and sometimes in other countries as well. Then the committees changed. So about late 2004 to 2005, there were some quite big changes in the Australian committee. The chair, who had been seen as being quite open to switch, changed. And there were other changes in the committee. And you can see that there was a bit of a loss of confidence there as well. And what happened was the media blew up some mystery shopping around Xenical, and that was around 2007, 2006, 2007, and that had implications for pharmacy not being trusted as much. And that had ongoing ramifications. So we had very conservative situation with not much switching for the next little while. The last period there is 2016 to 2017, because that was when these figures were updated. And since then, Australia's moved into a very much more positive space and suddenly is having a lot more reclassifications. Now, New Zealand's gone the opposite way. New Zealand had a big change in the committee in 2004, and that committee was encouraged to put out examples of medicines they'd like to see come up in front of the committee. And that really generated quite a lot of interest from the pharmaceutical industry. And you can see that we had quite a number of medicines move from prescription to non-prescription. Now, note the different axes here. On the left, we go 0 to 10. On the right, we go 0 to 16. So the applications, the number of applications and the numbers passed were quite a lot higher in New Zealand over that time. This has since declined a lot for a number of reasons. And that includes the fact that, that the committee has become more and more transparent and requiring more of the application to be published, for example, and changes in committee as well. There are some bright spots. The USA is seen very favourably for applicants. They want to put in applications. They get a 3-year data exclusivity. They see a huge market potential because of the population and the culture to do self-medication and the cost of going to the doctor there. UK, their leadership, which actually faded a little bit about 3 or 4 years ago, but that's really come back strongly now with the recent switch of desogestrel as the progestogen-only pill. And they're seen really well. They've got a really strong political desire for switch that's been long-standing since 2002. They've got low transparency, so others don't know what you're up to, and you have a bit of a commercial advantage over. You don't have immediate generic entry. And there's some confidence in pharmacy there as well. They've got the pharmacy-only medicine model, and they've got a decent-sized population. So there's a number of reasons why the UK is in that leadership position. Japan has data exclusivity on post-marketing surveillance, which is helpful. So they, again, may not have immediate generic competition. Austria has separate process just through the regulator for some medicines, and that makes it a bit easier for companies when their committee is seen as being really conservative. And Australia and New Zealand have this pharmacist only ability, which is helpful, and they may be able to mandate training on top of it and have other requirements around it. So it's quite common in New Zealand to have something that is only for pharmacists who have gone through extra training. That helps get things across the line. So in terms of maximising switch, we have to make the environment something that works for applicants. And there's a number of ways in which applicants can be encouraged to do switches. And you really need a lot of these things in place for an applicant to want to switch a medicine. And there's the regulator, the committee, and the process. There's a number of things there. Government will really helps. No patch protection in the UK, general practice is funded on a per capita basis. So whereas in Australia, they're funded as a fee for service. So Australian general practitioners really do not want any switch to happen because that loses their income. In the UK, it doesn't. It takes pressure off them. So they're a little bit more open there. Confidence in pharmacy helps as discussed. Previous positive switch experiences. When a committee has had other switches that they've agreed to go well, then they get more encouragement to switch more medicines. Having good evidence, that flexibility, that can-do attitude, and that committee makeup is so important. But actually, everybody needs some bravery. It's not the easiest option sometimes to pursue a switch for a company. You might fail. It can be a lot of money. What else should be putting the money into? Statins in the US, they've tried to do switches, and the development process of those switches has seen companies spend tens of millions of dollars get nothing. So it's it takes a bit of confidence to put together switch applications and decide to pursue that. And for the committee and the regulator to do a first in world switch, that takes some bravery as well. It's easier to take a conservative approach sometimes, so that sort of needs to be considered. Just to show the very many impacts on switch and whether a company wants to do a switch and whether a committee will agree to a switch. We've got a lot of different aspects coming through here. This is an example from some research I did in Germany a few years ago, and it shows the red shows all the barriers and the green shows the enablers, and sometimes they can be both barriers and enablers, but it just gives you an indication that actually it's not straightforward why it happens or doesn't. And in actual fact, if you look at a company making a decision about a particular product in a particular market, they'll have influences from the market itself, what that product is like, information from the company. AstraZeneca, for example, is a very prescription-focused company, and so they don't tend to pursue OTCs. They don't have an OTC field force. They don't have expertise in that area. Product factors and how that product works within the market. So, for example, chloramphenicol eye drops will not switch in the US probably because they have huge concerns about potential side effects with chloramphenicol, and they've already got an antibacterial eye drop available. So it's got a lot of different things going on there. So my final thoughts: the process has some similarities around the world. There's a strong focus on risk. Judgment and assumptions are involved, so we do need good research, and we also need good committee guidance. Switch is affected by many factors. It can go up and it can go down in different countries. It's driven by sponsors, so we need to make it attractive to them. And I think that FIP and pharmacy organisations could really encourage switch. And for community pharmacists, it would be great to be able to prove what you're doing through evidence and help to try and encourage companies to make those switches to increase what opportunities we have to help our communities.
So thank you, Natalie, for an excellent presentation. While you were talking, apart from the lot of information you shared with us, I was thinking first as a pharmacist, how we really need to have these medicines at our hand for the benefit of the patients. Too many times we simply shrug our shoulders when a patient comes to us and say, hey, you can only go to the GP for a prescription medicine. I'm very sorry, I cannot help you with your problem. And we suffer that every day in our daily practice. So first, it's a very practical tool to support patients. We do not have to lose the focus on that. And secondly, it was very interesting for me, the FIP being the international hub for information between pharmacists. How interesting are those differences between very close countries, as the examples you said, New Zealand and Australia, and Germany and Austria. It's a very complex path to switching medicines, and it was very well put forward to our attendees. Thank you, Natalie, for your excellent presentation. Looking forward for the Q&A later. We already had a couple of questions, very interesting ones. Keep them coming. Thank you to those putting your questions in the Q&A box. So now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Andy Shirtcliffe. Her background is in community pharmacy, both in New Zealand and in the UK, where she owned her own pharmacy for 5 years. Now I am right. Currently, she is the clinical chief advisor for pharmacy and allied health for the Ministry of Health of New Zealand. She has experience in writing, training, and assessing for the New Zealand College of Pharmacists and the Intern Pharmacist program. And she is the current chair of the Ministry of Health's Medicines Classification Committee and was the joint project manager on New Zealand's inaugural framework for pharmacist services. She has an extensive governance experience with the Pharmacy Council and New Zealand College of Pharmacists, of which she was the deputy chair and as a board member of the Pharmaceutical Society of New Zealand. She was a member of the Australian Pharmacy Council's Accreditation Committee, and she is currently an honorary associate professor at the Auckland University School of Pharmacy. Her area of special clinical interest is medicines optimization, and she has a current clinical role in dementia care. Over the years, she has developed and provided medicine optimization roles in high deprivation areas, primary healthcare settings, community pharmacy, and residential care facilities. In the last 2 years, Andy has been New Zealand's pharmacy lead for the national COVID-19 response. What an important task. And the pharmacy lead on their national COVID-19 vaccination rollout. Very important too, of course. A recent study has included in strategic thinking at Oxford University Health Policy and Health Economics at the London School of Economics, and a micro-credential in medicines optimization from Auckland University. Thank you, Andy, for being with us today. You may begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Kia ora tātou, talofa lava, warm Pacific greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I couldn't resist starting my presentation with some enticing photos of Aotearoa, New Zealand, when this crazy pandemic world that we live in at the moment settles down. I'd love to invite you all to come and see our beautiful country, and just a little glimpse of what it's like over here for you all. And I'd like to also thank the FIP for the opportunity to present tonight on this really important topic. Along with Natalie, I have been involved in medicines reclassification work in a number of different realms for about 20 years, and it's an area that I'm very passionate about. For us, as Natalie said, this is this evening. This evening, I'd like to cover a few things. Talk a little bit about what the classifications are for medicines in New Zealand, with a small comparison with a few international countries, and talk a little bit about why we reclassify or switch medicines. I'd like to talk a little bit about how medicines are reclassified in New Zealand, and I've included in my presentation, which I understand will be made available, some links to what I hope will be some helpful resources. I undertook a literature search to gather together information about what medicines are available without prescriptions around the globe. And at this point, I need to apologise. My literature search is restricted to what's available in English. That is the only language that I'm fluent in. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Natalie Gold. The result of my literature search is that Natalie is the author or the co-author of a reasonable proportion of the references, which I've included in the end as a bibliography. So just to acknowledge that Natalie is truly a world leader in this area of switching medicines. And I've also, I'll close out my presentation with some thoughts about what next and why. So just to clarify, I have no pecuniary conflicts of interest to declare. I am the current chair of the New Zealand Reclassification Committee. And you have all been informed of my Ministry of Health role. I just want to be clear that the views in this presentation are my personal views, and they are not New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand government policy. So in New Zealand, we have 5 categories of medicines: controlled drugs, which are medicines like morphine, oxycodone, prescription medicines, which would probably be our biggest category. As Natalie indicated, we have a restricted or a pharmacist only category, which must be provided by a pharmacist and in a pharmacy. We have a pharmacy-only medicine category, which is to be provided from a pharmacy, not necessarily by a pharmacist. However, in New Zealand, it's a legal requirement for a pharmacist to be present if a pharmacy is open. So people who are accessing pharmacy-only medicines have increased access from a premises where they have the ability to access support and advice from a medicines health professional if they need it or seek it. And of course, we have a general sales medicines category, which many countries around the world have, where medicines are available from pretty much anywhere, supermarkets, corner stores, etc. There's some overlap with Natalie's presentation, for which I apologise. But just to recap, we have some countries like the United Kingdom, Denmark and Sweden who have prescription pharmacy only general sales, but they don't have the restricted pharmacist only category. In the United States, as I understand it, there's neither of these intermediate categories of restricted or pharmacy only. And there are many other variations on these classifications around the world. So to repeat, there is variation around the world, but there is wide agreement that switching medicines to over-the-counter can improve access for people, can save time, save cost, support choice, and support self-management. So why do we reclassify or switch medicines? Well, I think it's appropriate to have sessions like this under the FIP banner of self-care. Self-care is the commonest way that people participate in personal health care to manage illness and to stay well. And self-care includes self-medication, sometimes following a diagnosis and having a medicine prescribed, and sometimes following a pharmacist's recommendation and use of a non-prescription medicine. Reclassification has facilitated self-care around the globe. To quote one of our references, stimulating the shift have been movements for consumerism and health promotion, including policy recognition of the importance of patient-centred care and self-management. So the presence of the pharmacist only and pharmacy only categories may be a key enabler for reclassification or switching of medicines. By enabling the easier access to professional advice, to cover off and address some of the perceived risks about increasing access to these medicines that can't just be covered off by labelling and packaging. That extra support and access to advice in these categories enables reclassification and thereby enables and supports greater self-care. And I have a view that enabling optimal over-the-counter access from community pharmacy, our trusted community-based health professional team, has the potential to reduce the need to source medicines from the internet and thereby reduce exposure to fakes and counterfeit medicines, which, as we all know, is a growing problem around the world. So just to triangulate that view that responsible self-medication with non-prescription medicines is a key part of self-care, as reflected in this statement from the World Self-Medication Industry. So in New Zealand, as mentioned previously, we have a ministerial committee that advises our health minister on the classification of all new medicines except controlled drugs they're dealt with by another committee, and advises the Minister on the reclassification of existing medicines. It's comprised of medical practitioners, pharmacists and government officials, and at the moment our government officials are myself as a pharmacist, and we have a public health physician on the committee as well. And I've included the link here to our website for our classification committee, as we have all of our minutes, proposals, consultations, all available on the website for people to go and access. We also have an online database that lists the classification. It's a searchable database, and it lists the classification of all medicines in New Zealand. So I've included that link here in case that's helpful for people wishing to explore further. Now, my apologies, this slide breaks all the PowerPoint rules, but again, I thought it was helpful to include this so that people can, members of the audience, when they receive the slides, can read it in detail. I've just included it to show that the committee considers quite a wide range of factors when they're deliberating over reclassification of a medicine in New Zealand. We have in Aotearoa in New Zealand, we have introduced recently a relatively new process whereby, and Natalie mentioned it, referred to it in her presentation, whereby we have had a precedent developing for requiring extra training for some medicines, and that has been helpful in getting some reclassifications across the line. We've recently introduced a process which is reasonably new, and it's still, I think it's fair to say it's still evolving, where if the committee is considering a medicine to go into the pharmacist only category, we hand this over to our pharmacy council, who regulates pharmacists so they understand the scope and the competence standards, and to the Pharmaceutical Society, who would be our lead practice advisor and CPD provider in New Zealand. And they go through a joint exercise to advise the committee as to whether they think for the medicine in question, whether extra training is required. So that first link on the slide is to a document which describes the framework that they follow in providing advice back to the committee. And the second link actually links to a determination that was made for melatonin. Now, in this situation, the council and the society went through the process. They decided that pharmacists in general don't need extra training, that provision of this medicine falls within their scope and their standards. However, since they'd been through the process, they pulled together a brief document to provide guidance for pharmacists who maybe aren't feeling quite so confident about it. Maybe it's a medicine that they haven't had much to do with, and it provides guidance on which competence standards and which areas to self-assess against, and where to go to support some self-directed upskilling in CPD. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I undertook a literature search and have pulled together on this slide I can't claim that it's totally exhaustive. My search was limited to research in English, but I hoped that it would provide a reasonably comprehensive list of medicines that could be considered for switching into those intermediate type categories of pharmacist only and pharmacy. I think that in New Zealand we have most of these medicines in one form or another available off prescription, and hopefully that is of helpful to the members of the audience who may wish to look to influence shifting and reclassification of medicines in your home jurisdiction. So this is a reasonably good collection of medicines that can expand the role of pharmacists in our communities to support increased access to medicines and to support self-care. And this got to thinking, and given that I was asked to talk on what medicines are, what medicines should be over the counter and why, I got to thinking about what would next steps look like. Now, as part of that same literature search, I came across, and again, I have to acknowledge our previous speaker, Natalie Gold, and one of the pieces of research that she and her colleagues have undertook, the research identified a number of categories of medicines that are often not supported for reclassifying or switching. And I got to thinking about what could be possible. Now, I haven't included all of them there, but I have included the ones where I think there's potential to expand the pharmacist role safely. For example, anti-infectives. When a person sees a prescriber and it's not urgent to prescribe on the day of the consultation, I'd like to see a world where, or a practice where pharmacists are able to follow up on lab results and supply antibiotics directly from the pharmacy according to the test outcome. Now, I can see that that would result in a number of situations where antibiotics wouldn't be needed at all, so thereby that would support a reduction in overall antibiotic use. And where they are needed based on the lab results, it would enable quite specific and targeted antimicrobial provision in line with local resistance patterns and the sensitivity based from the lab result. And another one that I'd like to shine a light on is enabling stable patients on uncomplicated hypertension. I can see a case for supporting ongoing supply for a defined period, say with a requirement for annual review by a diagnostician, according to an agreed treatment plan where the pharmacist has access to labs if they're needed to inform monitoring, and an ability to contribute to the medical record so that everybody in the healthcare team and the patient can see what's been supplied and when. So I think there are a number of areas that we could go to in our reclassification and switching journey. And I thought it was important for me to speak to why I think we need to plan to go this extra step, essentially from treatment of self-limiting acute conditions by and large through to improving access to support for long-term condition management without a prescription. Well, first and foremost, I think pharmacists have the competence to manage ongoing medicines management discussions. They are, after all, our medicines management experts. I think even before COVID, we had increasing population healthcare need and pressure on our health workforces. And that clearly indicates that we have a need to support optimal health self-management. As we've said, reclassification supports self-management. And it increases access to medicines for those who are able to self-manage, particularly if they're publicly funded. And it also frees up other health professionals in the team to better support those with more complex needs, and frees up their time to focus on what they and only they can do. So in closing, I was asked if I had any comments about whether the COVID-19 world that we're living in and our experiences over the last couple of years, whether that has any impact on my views or what I've presented in my presentation, or what I've found in my literature search. And I'm going to restrict my comments to a couple of very brief observations. I've spent my last 2 years, like all of you, immersed in COVID responses. And just to say, these comments from the WHO health workers are at the front line of our pandemic response in each and every measure of public health capacity, and health systems and essential services have been disrupted to a scale that none of us could have imagined. So if we had increasing workforce pressure and increased healthcare need before the pandemic, COVID-19 has really just shone a light and exacerbated and increased my conviction that medicine reclassification and supporting our pharmacists to walk to the entire breadth and top of their scope is important. And the WHO workforce predictions that we need 18 million more healthcare workers to achieve universal health coverage by 2030 in our low and lower middle income countries just reinforces that need, I think. We need to be doing all that we can to use all of our health professions to their maximum potential. And I think there's so much more that we as pharmacists can do to help. So thank you. On my last slides, I've included a bibliography for anybody who'd like to access any of the references that I've used.
So thank you, Andy, for your excellent presentation and for sharing your expertise. We know all the three speakers are very busy, have a very busy life, and we're very thankful that you could find the time to share your thoughts and expertise with the attendees. So one thing that resonated very much from your presentation to me is you put it very clear in your slides that the presence of the pharmacist and pharmacy-only medicines are a key enabler for reclassification. And I just want to state how important it is for us in the pharmacy profession. When we face a patient, we simply cannot limit ourselves to put the medicines in their hands. The medicines they need, it is of course very important. But as healthcare professionals, we need to also add the information the patient needs. We cannot simply give them the medicine and that's it. We cannot simply limit us to that, because we are also representing the pharmacy profession. When people think of pharmacy, they think of their community pharmacist. It was also said by Natalie, what thoughts people in those committees that are going to decide if medicines are going to be switched or not. They also have their own personal thoughts about the pharmacy profession, and that's very important. In every committee that the pharmacists are involved or need to have a decision from professionally, we need to do our best when we face patients, because we are also representing the pharmacy profession. It's not only our professional role and obligation to do that, but we are also representing the profession. So sorry for this long statement. I just wanted to say it because it's very important. Thank you, Andy, for your presentation. Looking forward to interacting with you during the Q&A time in a few minutes. Thank you very much. We move on now to, thank you, Andy, to introduce our next speaker. His name is Anthony Serratino-Inglot. He's a professor at the Department of Pharmacy, Faculty of Medicine and Surgery from the University of Malta. Professor Serratino Inglot studied pharmacy at the University of Malta and is a registered pharmacist. He continued his postgraduate studies at the University of Cincinnati, where he obtained a doctorate degree in pharmacy and completed a residency at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. Dr. Serratino Inglot has published over 100 scientific papers and has delivered a number of presentations and international conferences related to the pharmaceutical and regulatory sciences. Dr. Serratino Inglot's consultancy experience includes being a court expert in toxicology and forensic sciences, advisory roles to ministries and government entities, as well as qualified person for the pharmaceutical industry. He's the chairman of the Malta Laboratories Network and chair within the Ethics Committee, Faculty of Medicine and Surgery. He is a member of the Board of Governors of the Malta Competition and Consumer Affairs Authority, talking about the importance of having pharmacists in these very important committees. Since 2013, Professor Anthony Serratino Inglot is the chairperson of the Malta Medicines Authority. Thank you, Anthony, for being with us today. You may now begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to this audience of pharmacists and people working associated with pharmacy. It's wishing a good morning and good evening, depending on which part of the world the pharmacists are with us. We will be looking at aspects of diagnostics as they relate to self-care. And along this time of presentation, we will look at mainly aspects of safety, quality, and efficacy during the service that is given to in the community pharmacy to promote self-care. Another important aspect is the reliability of our results, the reliability of the results obtained from these diagnostics and their application. Their application in the question of empowering the patient in doing self-care, in a safe and reliable manner. We could put guidelines. We have very established and robust guidelines for the prescribing of medicines, for the dispensing of medicines, for advice that the pharmacist gives on medicines, but perhaps we lack more guidelines to incorporate these aspects, which is relatively new in the pharmacy. These aspects of guiding how the pharmacist could do this. The guidelines are, first of all, you have to have conformity assessment. The other aspect is to have an information campaign that shows the contribution of the pharmacist, towards this area of self-care through the use of diagnostics. This all requires training and education. Training and education that could start with the undergraduate training for the pharmacists, with the undergraduate training for the pharmacy technicians, and then the education in general, the continuing education, for example, on the development of new diagnostics that would come available from time to time and that we are seeing developing from nearly every year. So, the importance of self-documentation. So it is not only the documentation that we are used to document the patient's medication record, but also to encourage and to show how the patients themselves should, in self-care, document the self-care that they are applying, so that when one needs to refer back to what has been done, these documents of self-care may not be in the patient records, but could be presented by the patient through self-care. For example, the results from the diagnostics of the self-care the patients need to keep records of those specific results. Then there is the question of finance. Finance is an important thing that comes into all aspects, and we have to see how this diagnostics and self-care is going to be financed. We need to be prepared for change, and we need to also to ensure that when these diagnostics are introduced or patients are encouraged to use diagnostics in their self-care aspect, this is done in a sustainable manner. There are some challenges that one could propose this audience to reflect upon. For example, do we need to change the legislature? Do we need to change the regulations? Do you need to change the SOPs? Do we need in introducing especially new regulations that deal with diagnostics? Do we need a transition period? And should we have this harmonized throughout all the pharmacies in the country, or in Europe, for example, or on the continent, or even from a world point of view? Should we have common specifications for the equipment that you use, common specifications for the range of tests used, common specifications for the normal values that are recommended in the test? And then we should prepare ourselves for the next step forward, which will be one of the biggest challenges that we will feel sooner, that we will meet with sooner rather than later. And this is the question of remote monitoring. We are already seeing a number of remote monitoring, for example, in number of conditions, in children, for example, with diabetes, where they are monitored and the results are sent to specialized centers that could bring the attention to the areas where the patient is situated, and then the ethics in doing this, the data protection regulations that we are seeing improving day by day. And this is what role does the pharmacist play in this remote monitoring of his patients? While doing all this, and we have to look at the advantage of the movement of the testing, of the diagnosis from an isolated laboratory, for example, where it's very difficult to become patient-centered, to take the advantage that our pharmacy could be patient-centered. And so in this self-care, in the population targeted for these diagnostics, we have to ensure that there is a creative value, that we create a value, and that the test gives a value, an added value, an additional value to what we would have gained to the situation of the patient if there was no diagnostic element in this self-care expanded by the pharmacist. And then we also have to take the other advantage that we have in pharmacy, that we are very good collaborators. We could collaborate with other healthcare professionals in doing this. And then also the advantage that the test done through self-care, the advantage is that the test done at point of care, we could go into a real-time decisions that could be much more compliant, that you get the patient much more compliant once you get a real-time advice and a real-time decision. Then finally, we should think about the access. It's useless to have all these diagnostics available if there isn't access, and then access with a certain equality of access. There could be many ideas, many theoretical aspects that could be put forward for what we could do for self-care from the pharmacy. However, the logistics are of extreme importance, because if you in practice, that is what could be done in practice. This depends on the setting in the community pharmacy, on the time that the professionals, the pharmacist, the pharmacy technician have at their disposal to do this. And in all these effects, it's important to be transparent. It's important to be transparent and authentic. That is, the patient has to know exactly what are the value of those tests that you are doing, what contribution they give to their life improvement, to their medical improvement, and also that everything is authentic. That is, in other words, that the client should know exactly, even, for example, if a test is not working, if the equipment is not working, to be as transparent as possible. And again, to align with other features that are taking place in that particular country. In other, for example, if one is has an obesity, one is fighting obesity, then one would use the diagnostics of weight and body structure in alignment with the targets that are being placed in that health system. And this would lead, this collaboration, this transparency, this authenticity would lead to more compliance for the treatment of the patient and for better self-care. Quality. We have mentioned in the beginning that safety is one of the most important things that we do. The same features that we apply each and every day in our life as pharmacists, that mainly of safety, quality, and efficacy in each and every medicine that we do, that same concept, that same ideal, that same motivation has to be now transmitted and applied for diagnostics. And quality remains an important feature. In this case, the quality of medicines usually that rely on the community pharmacists is to ensure the good storage, to ensure that they are not falsified medicines. In the case of diagnostics, the responsibility for quality is greater. It's greater because the robustness that is applied to the supply of medicines is not as rigid as for the supply of diagnostics. And this quality depends on two areas. We have to look at the quality through our systems analysis, to the system that we use, and then to the equipment. In the case of the system, we have to see that the systems that we introduce in our pharmacy, the systems that we introduce for the patient self-care, the self-care diagnostics that the patient use must be patient-friendly. They also have to be personalized to that particular type and abilities and knowledge of that patient. We have to take the opportunity that through the self-care use of diagnostics, we would have reduced the white coat effect. For example, in the management of the management of possible hypertension, the management of blood pressure measurement, then that effect, which is well known and well documented, it could be that if the patient goes into self-care in blood pressure measurements, then that white coat effect would be decreased, and we have to take advantage of that situation. And then a great importance remains in the interpretation of the results. You could have the best results possible, the most accurate results, but you have to interpret those results well. And for this, you need an action plan of how often would you carry out a blood sugar level, for example. How often would you carry out a blood pressure measurement? In a reasonable way in ensuring good and appropriate self-monitoring. In the case of equipment, we are seeing a lot of developments here in Europe about the moving from the directives to regulations, which will harmonize more and more the type of equipment we have, the quality of equipment we have, through better analysis of the significance of the CE marking through the working group of the competent authorities, medical devices. And in this, we are seeing new regulations that will assure more. Even pharmacists would be using, and clients who would be using equipment, who would be using medical devices to measure their various parameters, that these are of the right quality to the new medical device regulations that are being established in Europe at this moment. Calibration and range of accuracy, as well as the possible reference to control laboratories and the alignment of the results that are obtained in the community or in self-care measurements with those of the country's laboratories in what is treated as normal, what is treated as a range of error, are also to be taken into consideration. The diagnostics require a careful strategy. And this is where FIP is giving a good contribution to install a strategy for the use of diagnosis through its technology forum, for example. The strategy must rely that the aim is to meet the self-care goals. So it has to be seamless with self-care goals for other features in self-care. Also, we have to think that the strategy would have to rely on big data, would have to contribute to big data, so that we have the right information about what is going on in other places, so that one could compare how well one is doing through peer review. We need professionalism to do this. We need resources and support. And importantly, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, that this strategy requires a political leap forward. The other thing is that we have our regulators, our pharmacy regulators, our competent regulators for the pharmacy profession that regulate the functions of the pharmacists. These same regulators are usually used to regulate aspects that deal with medicines. Those regulators themselves, we as regulators ourselves, have to develop a concept that the pharmacist is now dealing with self-care, and in this self-care, one may be using a substantial amount of diagnostic features. The digitalization, we cannot entail this aspect unless we refer to digitalization. Digitalization is important to get a mature diagnostic process. Mature diagnostic process by using the best smartifying aspects that we build on the progress that is done with digitalization in other areas. While at the same time, we have to realize that this is transforming the landscape in which self-care is working, in which pharmacy is working, that this has still to be done in a sustainable manner and in collaboration with all the stakeholders, including other health professionals. And this requires synergism between all stakeholders working in this. Digitalization still requires to mature. Digitalization has to keep in the front line the importance of access to patients. Digitalization is, unless it could be accessed by all patients, and that is what is hoped that will happen into the future, it will be fruitless. There has to be this cultural shift in society to start thinking digital. The other aspect of digitalization that we are going to see in the near future is that these medical devices, through the Internet of Things, we will see that these medical devices will relate directly, will transmit directly to the health data system. So you could be working with a medical device in self-care, and that results that you get with that medical device will automatically go into your patient record. Risk, we have mentioned safety, quality, and efficacy. And risk determines all this. There is nothing without risk, but we have to be very extra careful about clinical risk. We have to be extra careful about the risks that patients will be taking of self-care. And the risk could be real in the case of diagnostic tests. Diagnostic tests should help with the present tools that we have, like taking a medical history, a pharmacist history, and now we could add with that in helping us to take decisions to diagnostic tests. It is important to realize that there is this risk, and that risk would mean that you should not treat the patient according to the result, but you should treat the results as collaborative evidence to all our traditional and present features that we do in doing our diagnostics. So diagnostic tests should serve as an aid to the normal functions that we always are used to do in pharmacy, say in the risks that are exerted. We should not, because of the diagnostic tests, neglect that there are other features that one uses in monitoring the patients, like behavioral changes, and that the diagnostic test should also be a means to decide when to refer the patient for further assessment. So self-care, diagnostics are used a lot for self-care in chronic diseases. And one important aspect is that in addition to the patient empowerment, that we are giving now another empowerment to the patient in self-care. We are considering an advancement in the usual self-care empowerment where they could go to do exercise or to do diet, but also now in dose adjustments, for example, in the sugar measurements, in the amount of sugar that one has, and then one could adjust the amount of insulin that is being injected. And similar in several other areas where with the advancement of new drugs, those adjustments will become more critical. It's perhaps at this time one cannot not mention COVID and the pandemic. And we have seen there are many lessons that we can learn with diagnostics. And it is enough to look at the self-care, at the rapid antigen detection test, and at the self-care of used in self-testing for the COVID, in detecting, say, of viral components, in looking at the sensitivity of this test, looking at the specificity of this test, and how reliable these tests are, and the contribution of pharmacists in the use of these diagnostics was self-evident in many countries. Still, one remains that about the discussion about the quality of the device used, the reliability of the device used, and also importantly, the interpretation of the result. And here also one could easily see, one could recognize the importance on the reporting action of the results from these diagnostics. One could conclude that the area of diagnostics, the diagnostics are our signal for self-care. They are the signal in providing the information. And this information is good because it's in real time, and we could get real-time response to that information. It also provides the knowledge needed to control and manage a particular condition. But most importantly, diagnostics should be used to lead to more wisdom in our decisions, more wisdom in decision-making that should be guided, not for the sake of writing a diagnostic test, not for the sake of result, but to use the diagnostic information and knowledge to reach to use that wisdom, to improve our wisdom, to put our wisdom into action with the aim, with the final aim of improving the experience of the patient. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Dr. Serafino Inglot, for another excellent presentation, very timely also because of the COVID pandemic, when we know that community pharmacy is helping in different ways, testing patients, referring, putting the results into the system, helping healthcare systems that are absolutely overwhelmed, especially here in Europe with the new strain Omicron. And we can be very proud of the work we are doing. So I will now ask our three speakers to turn on their cameras for a very fast Q&A time. Thank you to the speakers also for answering the questions that have been put already in the Q&A box. Thank you very much. So I will take my privilege as moderator to ask you a question. And in your views, what is the most important enabler and barrier for switching medicines or testing diagnostics into the hands of the pharmacist? If you may please begin, Natalie, that's okay.
Sure. There's such a huge variety of barriers and enablers that every single country is so different, and so, you know, one big enabler is having a massive market. So US has this massive market that's huge, but then they don't have pharmacy only. So I think the pharmacy only, pharmacist only categories, they're a really, really, really good enabler. But having a tiny market, as we do in New Zealand, creates such a difficulty. Having also other mechanisms for pharmacy to be able to provide medicines is can mean that reclassification, that switch isn't as necessary. So if you look at the collaborative prescribing model that is sometimes used in the US, the pharmacist prescribing used in Canada that was actually discussed on the chat earlier, patient group directions in the UK. In New Zealand, we're using standing orders to treat hepatitis C. So, you know, with that sort of thing, you don't need to switch your medicine. And if you do pharmacist prescribing, you can get a whole wave of products. You don't need to go product by product, which is quite costly and slow.
Thank you. So Andy, if you want to add something, please.
Thank you, and thank you for that great response, Natalie. It's always hard going first, and I was wondering which one to choose, so it's made it a bit easier for me. I think I'm going to vote for the trust and confidence in the pharmacist. I know through, let's just take the last 2 years of my career working through helping to support our nation's COVID response and seeing my colleagues and what they've stepped up to do, that how quickly they have taken on new things, how well they've worked with other health professions. And I am now seeing in my role people in the corridors of the ministry referring to things that pharmacists can do that, and it's not me I'm not the first one to say it. So that's just been a sea change. And so I think that others understanding what the profession can contribute and having that trust and confidence in their ability to do it well, do it safely, doing it in a patient-centered way is, that's the one I'm going to vote for. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And Anthony, may I have your answer, please?
Yes, I would put it as I would put major things that are put into practice, and that is education and training. Education and training is key. After that, I think the next important thing would be the way that reimbursement is going to be done. Who is going to pay for the cost of these tests so that they will be applied in an equitable manner. And then, as was mentioned for the other things, and that is extremely important, is to ensure that trust is built. And trust is built if we ensure that there is quality, safety, and efficacy in all the work we do. And so if we transmit what we do for medicines and apply that for diagnostics, then I think we'll be on the safe road.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, I have the slides back to finish the webinar for today. Pharmacists always rank first in different national trust reports. We go either first, second, or third with firemen, physicians, and nurses. Politicians go all the way back in every jurisdiction. So trust is a treasure we have in the profession, and we need to build on that. Thank you. So just again, a super big thank you from all of us in FIP to all the three panelists for investing their time with us today. If I may have the next slide, please. Just a very fast conclusions. There are many benefits switching medicines or diagnostic tests into pharmacy. Earlier treatment, savings for healthcare, more people into health systems by way of being referred by pharmacists, and safer medicines by means of less counterfeit. There are many different national, regional variations in the formal process, different studies required, committees, guidelines, medicines categories, which is key, timings. It is a process sometimes initiated by governments. There's always a lot of focus, of course, in risks, not so much in the potential benefits this switch can have for patients. Of course, human factors, judgments, interests are in place. Companies that do not want to upset physicians, people, the feelings that the people into those committees have about the pharmacy profession. Sometimes it's protection for the products by means of less generic competitions, the way they affect GP funding systems, the amount of the investment that companies have to put. It's not always a straightforward process with many barriers and enablers. The presence of pharmacists and the pharmacy-only medicines category is a key enabler for reclassification. Again, trust comes into this webinar. And we have to have in mind data protection and ethics. Remote monitoring is coming into our pharmacies. We need to have that in mind. And the importance of having safe, quality, and efficacy for testing procedures, which always do not have such a rigid process in place as medicines. So if I may have the next slide, please. It's my pleasure to close the webinar. Please do not forget to register for the next last webinar in this series about sexual health, which is a very important matter. It resonated in this webinar too with different medicines in that area being reclassified, the after morning pill, and other trimethoprim, etc. So it's a very important category. And the next slide, check all the future FIP digital events here at this at the FIP.org website. And also thank you again to Reckitt for supporting this online program that has been made available to you by the FIP. And I think we go to the last slide. Thank you all for attending this webinar. As community pharmacists and pharmacists, you are also very busy, and thank you for taking the time to improve yourselves. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you.